What if I told you that the Canadian Special Forces quietly leased a batch of Russian combat helicopters for Canadian operations in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2011? You see, the Canadians showed up in Afghanistan without any medium or heavy lift helicopter capability whatsoever. Ground-based resupply and troop transport were becoming increasingly more dangerous due to the influx of IEDs and roadside bombs in Afghanistan. To fix this, Canada ordered 6 CH-47D Chinook helicopters, but it would be years before they could actually use them because of bureaucratic red tape. So to fill the immediate need for medium lift helicopters for the Canadians leased a batch of Russian combat helicopters, specifically 4 Mi-17 V5s and 2 Mi-8T helicopters. And actually, the CH-47D Chinooks and the Mi-17 V5 aren't actually that different. They have a lot of similarities in capabilities, with Canadian crews actually saying that the Russian helicopters were more robust, reliable, and easier to maintain. Now, the 4 Mi-17 V5s were exclusively employed by 427 SOAS, or Special Operations Air Squadron, by the Royal Canadian Air Force for Afghanistan combat operations, actually gaining a Canadian designation of the CH-178, with the crews giving it 2 nicknames, the Short Bus and the Tragically Hip, as the name for the Mi-17 V5 is the Hip. Now, this isn't to be confused with Molson Air. Molson Air was originally thought to be the call sign of 427 Special Operations Air Squadron in Afghanistan, but it actually turned out to be a civilian-based helicopter company that was actually hired by the U.S. military to provide them transport of care packages, personal effects, and other things that the U.S. Army needed, since there was a serious lack of helicopter resources in Afghanistan. So Molson Air was a Canadian company that was hired by the Americans and worked exclusively with them, with their fleet of Sikorsky S-61s and Bell 212s.
My name's Deanna. I work for Molson Air here in beautiful sunny Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan.
Now, these weren't the first Russian helicopters to ever be employed or leased by the Canadian government, but these were certainly the first Russian aircraft of any kind to be used by the Canadian military. But this isn't as strange as you might think. You see, American Special Forces and the CIA have been using Russian helicopters, specifically of this type, for decades now. It actually seems to be a trend with Western Special Forces. So in this case, it just seems like the Canadian Special Forces are following suit. Now in 2011, all the CH-178s were given back. But to who? It's unclear exactly who these helicopters were owned and operated by previously, but we do know through public record that a Canadian company by the name of Skylink Aviation and its subsidiary Avia Aerostan, that some kind of backdoor deal was struck between the Canadian government, Skylink Aviation, and the Russian government. Now, the expedited and unusual nature of this deal only happened the way it did because it was Special Forces that required these helicopters. Special Forces in Canada are kind of in a league of their own, and they get whatever they want whenever they want. They have priority funding and priority over everything. This is what ultimately allowed for the accelerated procurement process. Now, in 2010, when it was leaked to the public, the Canadian Special Forces were operating Russian combat helicopters in theater. There was a level of national embarrassment to some degree. This is why it's pretty tough to find any kind of media on these helicopters in the first place. Aside from OPSEC, the Canadian government didn't want its own people to know that it was operating these helicopters simply because of the fact that they were Russian. It's one thing to lease Russian helicopters for UNICEF or United Nations operations, but it's a whole nother thing to lease them for our special forces for in-theater operations. I've scraped the internet for as much media and information on these helicopters as I could for you guys. So I tried to put it all in one place for you guys right here on this video, so you don't have to go scrape the internet yourself, but there's really not a lot out there no matter how hard you try looking. Now, we do know a few things about these helicopters. We do know their serial numbers. We know that the Canadians leased 2 models, the Mi-17 V5 for the 427 SOAS squadron, and the Mi-8T model, which there's virtually no info or any kind of media surrounding these helicopters whatsoever. I assume those helicopters were either leased for another civilian agency, perhaps for some spare parts, or perhaps even for ultra-clandestine operations that we'll never be aware of. We also know that the CH-178s were used to taxi around CSOR and JTF, or Joint Task Force 2, in the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, which are basically the equivalent to the American Green Beret and Delta, or the American Rangers and Delta. It's the Special Operations, and 427 SOAS, or Special Operations Air Squadron, acts as the 160th SOAR would for those aforementioned Special Forces groups. So this is Special Forces helicopters taxiing around Special Forces personnel and other specialized and important personnel. We also know that CH-146 Ingress Griffins from 427 Squadron would escort these helicopters to and fro. In almost every picture, the CH-178 is armed with two C6 GPMG 7.62 millimeter machine guns, and you can see that they have the elongated shell casing sleeves. That's a telltale sign that those are Canadian birds. No other Mi-17 V5s or Mi-8 HIP series helicopters in theater rocked those sleeves, so that's how you know they were Canadian. We also see MWS sensors, or missile warning sensors, and flare dispensers. The cockpit seems to be basic. There's no electro-optical sensor turret, so they were obviously just using NVG goggles when operating at night. We also see that they utilized a basic one-color desert tan paint scheme with visible Canadian markings. And it's actually rumored that these helicopters were stored in the British SAS hangars away from prying eyes in Zangabad. So from 2008 to 2011, 427 Special Operations Air Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force was ripping through the skies of Afghanistan, spreading maple magic all over the Taliban. It's another little known chapter of Canadian military aviation history. Now let me know what you guys think. Did you even know these helicopters existed? If you did, let me know what you think of the Canadians using Russian helicopters in combat. And also let me know if you have any personal insight towards these helicopters, if you saw them on your tour, or if you were even on them on your tour. Let me know if you have any extra information, whatever. Northern Liberty Matt out.